After testing over 11 games at over 60 settings combinations, I can tell you that the Intel Arc B580 is faster on average than its direct price competitor from AMD with the RX 7600. However, if you go up a bit in price to the 7600 XT, which solves the 8GB VRAM issue, things get a lot more competitive, but for more money. So what am I talking about here? Intel's new Arc B580 is a 12GB GPU, priced the same as AMD's current 7600, which is an 8GB GPU. You can buy them as low as $250 right now, and that is, again, what the B580 is supposed to cost. Now, the 7600 XT version costs over $300. That's $315. That gets you 16 gigabytes of VRAM. It solves that VRAM issue, but for a lot more money. If you want to think of that as percentage differences, that means the 7600 XT costs 26% more than the B580 and the 7600, 8GB model, which is a big difference. Now, some of you are gonna wish that I had compared this against the 6750 XT. Well, these are getting harder to find, for one thing. I can find one model available at 320, and then it's going up from there, and they're low in stock. And the 6700 XT, I can't find any in stock anymore at reasonable prices. These used to be the GPUs I would recommend at this price point, but it's looking like they're drying up on availability. So 7600 at $250 and 7600 XT at $315 it is. If you're wondering what about NVIDIA GPUs, I already made that video and it's already published before this one on my channel. So just look at my channel, you'll find the comparison against the 3060 and the 4060. This video is kind of focused on the AMD comparison head on. So let's go ahead and look at what I tested. So I have my usual massive head-to-head chart, not just chart, but like video footage where we can see things playing out side by side. You can see the 8GB 7600 absolutely choking on too much VRAM happening here in Final Fantasy. And we will look at these head-to-head comparisons. But I think that's going to be a good summary, a good in detail look where we could kind of in summary get the main idea out of the way right here. So basically what we're looking at is I actually tested 11 games. There's 10 on this chart. One of them has a driver issue that is currently unresolved, so I didn't include it in the relative performance charts. More on driver issues in a minute. But I tested Final Fantasy 16 at a variety of settings. I tested Dragon Age at a Veilguard at a variety of settings, God of War Ragnarok at a variety of settings, Ghost of Tsushima at a variety of settings, Silent Hill 2 at a variety of settings, Hellblade 2 at a variety of settings, Horizon Forbidden West at a variety of settings, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora at a variety of settings, Cyberpunk, and Call of Duty Black Ops 6, again at varieties of settings. Now, what do I mean by varieties of settings? Well, generally, people, especially on this price class of hardware, don't just play at ultra settings. So I do test ultra settings, but I also test out medium settings and sometimes low settings if it's needed in order to get to a good frame rate, like 60 FPS. Also, for my 1440p results, cards of this performance tier generally need upscaling, not always. So a lot of my 1440p results say 66% here. That means 66% per axis resolution scaling. That's what you would call FSR quality. Or if there were NVIDIA GPUs, that would be what you would call DLSS quality. I didn't call it quality upscaling here because Intel calls XeSS quality a different internal rendering resolution. It's their ultra quality that matches the internal rendering resolution at 66% per axis scaling, which is what I'm choosing to do here to max their internal rendering resolution, so match the internal rendering resolution when I'm using upscaled results. XeSS in general, I'm happy to say, often has better image quality than FSR, so that's a bit of an advantage for the Arc GPU. And talking about upscaling, I will say that of the 11 games I tested, 10 of them had XeSS, and those are the same 10 that had FSR. The only one that didn't have XeSS also didn't have FSR, and that was Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. I'm hoping it gets added later. That game just came out and currently only has DLSS, which is a bit disappointing, but it is what it is. Anyway, so in terms of like upscaling support, I would say, at least if you're playing newer AAA titles, XeSS is likely to be there and does generally give better image quality than FSR. However, if you're playing older titles, more of them are likely to have had FSR updates than XeSS updates. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, if we're looking at the B580 against the 7600, again, what this chart's showing is positive direction is B580 winning and by this percent, and negative direction is 7600 winning and the B580 losing by this percent. As you can see, the B580 wins way more often than not. Some of them dramatic, but these massive dramatic wins are generally a result of its VRAM advantage when the 7600 is going beyond 8 gigabytes of VRAM and its performance just absolutely chokes. So do keep that in mind, that if you're playing without the super heavy VRAM settings, then the results would be a bit closer. And while I didn't filter out for all of those results, I did also do the head-to-head against the 7600 XT, which has 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, it's not as simple as just a 16 gigabyte version of the 7600 because it also has some clock speed advantages. And so it generally performs better and has more VRAM. But if we look at this, it's kind of getting rid of the VRAM advantage. And we're looking at a more direct comparison of, what is the hardware actually able to do if it had enough VRAM. And here you can see it's a much more even split. It's like the B580 wins as often as it loses and by similar margins. So, exactly which one's winning is going to depend a lot on the game that you play. So, I mean, that's at least interesting, but keep in mind that the 7600 XT, like I said, costs 26% more. So if you were going to look at this from a value perspective, we need the 7600 XT is pretty much never 26% faster. It gets 20% plus faster in a few cases. But in other words, the B580 is, while it maybe is matching the performance of the 7600 XT, it is offering better value. Now, the 7600 XT has even more VRAM at 16 instead of 12, but at this performance tier, the type of settings you might use, 12's probably enough. Because, again, you're probably not playing max settings at 4K resolution or something like that, which is what currently you need to do to spill past 12, although it's always been the case that having more VRAM on your graphics card does help its longevity. Anyway, so those are all things to think about. Now, before we get into the just detailed head-to-head stuff here with this video, I also need to bring up the elephant in the room, because if this was all there was to say, if I'm just like, B580 crushes the 7600 at the same price, buy it instead. B580, is giving similar performance to the 7600 XT at a much lower price. Save the money, buy it instead. And the B580 has a better upscaler. Great, awesome. So what's the catch if there is one? So the big deal with the Intel Arc GPUs, my main issue I've had recommending them is their driver situation. And the drivers, I cannot stress this enough, their drivers have got so much better than they were 2 years ago when the first Arc series of GPUs launched. However, I still, when testing out Arc GPUs in new games, am much more likely to run into issues at launch when I'm testing out new games when they launch than I have been on AMD or NVIDIA GPUs. And I saw the same thing happening during this GPU review. Now, there's a bit of a silver lining here, which was Intel's team was incredibly responsive to fixing driver issues during the review period. Of the 4 games I had problems in, 3 of them are fixed, and Intel is currently in communication with me fixing the 4th. So the only one that is currently not fixed is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and I didn't get them information about that issue until just a couple of days ago, because that was the last game I tested, because I just kind of threw it in here at the end, because it was an interesting game, used a lot of VRAM, it's the first game to require hardware RT support, all of that. So anyway, that was interesting. So, but the issue is, if I do see driver issues, even if they fix them, it makes me a little bit worried that, they hadn't caught that before they shipped the review driver, which means, what if you play a game that reviewers didn't test? Because a lot of the testing for reviews is biased towards either newly released AAA games or games with built-in benchmarks that are widely tested, just because they're easy to test. And sometimes those will be older games, but their games tend to be the same games a lot. You see what I'm saying? So I'm a little bit concerned that this is a sign that, not every game has been tested thoroughly on the drivers for the Arc B580. And if that's the case, we caught a bunch of them during the review period, but how many slipped through the cracks? How many are you going to run into? But again, the silver lining is Intel has responded incredibly quickly to fixing them. So I really do think the Arc drivers are in a much better place than they used to be. I think it's much less of a concern than it used to be. But during this review, I can say that I did not have a single driver issue on AMD or NVIDIA in anything that I tested. But I did have driver issues on the B580. In 4 out of the 11 games I tested, 3 of which have been fixed. And these are major AAA releases. Now, what kinds of issues did I run into? I already mentioned this in my NVIDIA video, but if you didn't watch that one, do you see the flickering on this fog stuff here? That's not supposed to happen in God of War Ragnarok. You can see it again in this scene as well. But they did, like I said, during the review period, they did issue a patch. And in the side-by-side, if you watch it closely, it is fixed. We're not seeing the issues, and performance seems the same between these runs, which is good. Now, another game where I saw issues was the Dragon Age Veilguard. Do you see all the flickering on this foliage here? That looks pretty bad. It's fixed in a patch driver, so you shouldn't have to see this issue. But again, that was there when the review period began. So I just think that is a sign that other games may have slipped through the review period cracks, and I can't guarantee that, but it is a concern. Again, the patch has fixed it. Ghost of Tsushima was having large frame time spikes causing stutters on a regular basis on the original review driver. They have again patched that, and it has a smooth frame time graph now. So again, you shouldn't have to experience this issue. It is fixed. They responded quickly. That's good. But then also, when I test out Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, this one's a little harder to notice. But look here. Okay, this is what things should look like. The GPU's at 99% utilization. Performance looks good. The wattage is what it should be, although I think that their report only has the GPU wattage. I don't think it also includes the VRAM wattage. That's just kind of a side note. Anyway, the point is that what happens when I turn the camera? So I noticed in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, in this little initial area you start the game in that I was benchmarking, when I turned the camera down this initial pathway, do you see what happened? Performance tanked, the GPU usage percentage tanked, and the wattage tanked. So there's clearly some kind of problem happening here. And while it looks like a CPU bottleneck, I'm not CPU bottlenecked, and the NVIDIA and AMD GPUs in the same scene have massive headroom. So if there is anything happening with the CPU, it's only happening on the Arc driver. So I'm in communication with Intel about this. They've communicated that they can replicate the issue, so it's not just my system, and they are trying to fix it. Hopefully it's fixed by the time these GPUs are actually out there and you're buying one. But as of the time of recording this video, the night before the review embargo, I've waited as long as I possibly can, and while they've said they've confirmed the issue and they're working on it, they have not yet issued a fix. So that's what I have to say about drivers. They're way better than they used to be, but I'm still running into more problems during this review than I generally do with AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. So take that for what it will, and I think that puts a bit of a damper on the, what's actually looking like the best value GPU in this price range if you just look at the performance numbers. And again, has a better upscaler than the AMD counterpart, which is really nice. All right, let's round out this video with the massive amount of side-by-side comparisons. And we'll kind of move through this quickly because you've really kind of seen all of these results as I talked before. But what do you get out of these side-by-sides that you don't get elsewhere? Well, one thing you can look for is when GPUs run out of VRAM, sometimes you can spot missing textures. Another thing you can look at is the frame time graphs, because you can see here that like the B580 is a little bit spiky here despite having enough VRAM, which represents in the 1% lows, which is this measurement. Which I then type in down here, and I do some relative performance numbers here as well. Hopefully I've typed everything in correctly because I do all of that manually, and this took a massive amount of time, and I'm in a rush to get this review out ready for the embargo date. But do keep in mind that up here, these performance metrics are absolutely correct. So if anything's different up here than down here at the end of the benchmark pass, it's this one that's accurate. Anyway, by the way, if you want to look at this in full depth, side-by-side comparisons without me skipping ahead and talking over it, this full side-by-side comparison will be uploaded to the members feed on my channel as just kind of bonus material, where you get the full unedited, no talking over it. You don't see me skipping ahead. Anyway, you can see that in Final Fantasy 16 at 1080p Ultra, the 7600 with 8 gigabytes is absolutely choking, whereas the XT overall has the performance lead at 50 FPS. But if we drop down to medium settings, all the GPUs are doing a lot better, and we're generally around 60 FPS. The 7600 XT version still has the overall lead on that. But this is likely how you'd want to play the game. Now, if you had the VRAM for it, you might turn up textures or something like that. Anyway, if we go to 1080p low settings, performance numbers don't really change much. So the game looks worse and you don't benefit much from going down to low instead of medium. Maybe it claws you back a little bit more VRAM, something like that. If we go up to 1440p Ultra, none of the GPUs are doing great, although the 7600 XT has the lead here. If we kick on upscaling at the 66% per axis, or in other words, FSR quality, XeSS ultra quality, we can see the 7600 XT is pretty playable here at 49 FPS. B580 is okay at 44. I'd want better on both, but the 7600 8GB is just absolutely destroyed. The 8 gigabytes of VRAM is not cutting it here. At medium settings with 66% per axis upscaling, we are seeing that the 7600 XT is now over 60 FPS at 67. Which is nice. And then if we drop down to low settings, we once again see pretty similar performance to the medium settings. Now we're switching over to God of War Ragnarok. I already talked to you about the driver issues earlier, so let's just jump into the benchmarks. At 1080p Ultra, the 7600 XT is ahead, and the 7600 and B580 are basically tied. At 1080p medium settings, all of the GPUs are basically tied at 67 or 69. Nice. At 1440p Ultra, they're not super great, 39, 39, and 38. So very close performance in God of War Ragnarok. Very close performance at 1440p Ultra with 66% per axis resolution scale. Again, around 50. You'd ideally want a little bit higher. At 1440p medium, we're in the mid-50s now. Everything's, again, very similar performance. And with upscaling, we're now over 60 FPS on all of them. And again, also very similar performance on all of them. So not a lot to see here. Dragon Age Veilguard, I already mentioned that the driver issues have been patched, which is good to see. 1080p Ultra with selective ray tracing. The B580 and the 7600 XT are basically tied, whereas the 8GB card is absolutely destroyed. 1080p Ultra without ray tracing, we can see the 7600 XT has a small lead over the B580, and they're both doing way better than the 8GB 7600, indicating that 8GB is not enough for these settings. At 1080p medium, all the cards are doing very well and have very similar performance in the 80 FPS range. At 1440p Ultra with selective ray tracing turned on, but also using upscaling, the 7600 XT and the B580 are tied, whereas the 7600 is being crushed, but none of them are doing better than 45 FPS, so you'd probably not want to use these settings. It's playable, but meh. 1440p Ultra settings with upscaling, no ray tracing, boost performance up to 47 FPS on the GPUs that have enough VRAM, and the 7600 with only 8 gigabytes of VRAM is below 30 FPS. So you need more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM for these settings, but the other two cards aren't really doing that amazingly well anyway. At 1440p medium settings, they're all around 60, although the 7600 is a bit below and the other two are a bit above. Again, the 7600 XT and B580, very similar performance. At 1440p medium settings with upscaling enabled, we see that I made the first typo that I've noticed. Don't look at these. These look wrong. I accidentally left them the same. These numbers are correct up here. So it's actually that we are hanging out in the mid-70s on the B580 and 7600 XT and down in the 60s on the 7600. They're all very playable here, though. All right, let's go ahead and switch over to Ghost of Tsushima. Again, I noticed the frame time issues on the original driver, but that has been patched during the review period, so that should not trouble you guys. And I did retest, by the way, all the benchmarks that you'll see side by side are retested on the better driver. We see very similar performance in this game. The 7600 XT and B580 are tied at 77, and the 7600's a little bit behind at 73. Very similar performance. We'll notice that 1080p medium, they're all over 100 FPS. They're doing great and basically tied. At 1440p very high settings, now we're seeing that the 8 gigabytes of VRAM crushes the 7600. We're spilling over. Whereas the cards with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM are doing fine at 52 and 59 respectively. The B580 is the closest to holding 60 FPS at native 1440p with maximum settings. If you enable upscaling on the maximum settings at 1440p, we now see the B580 and the 7600 XT basically tied at 72 and 74, with the 7600 hanging way back at 60, indicating there's probably still a bit of a hang up on the VRAM capacity. 1440p medium settings, we now see our frame rates around 69, 71, and 76, respectively on that. So the B580 pulling into the lead here, although again, they're all offering you a similar type of gaming experience. Okay, we're getting into Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. I've already described the driver issues I had here, and the problem is the benchmark run I did is walking forward on the pathway when you first start the game, and that's where a lot of this issue takes place. Meaning, I feel like the B580 is underperforming here, so don't read too much into it. What we can definitely see, though, is 1080p Ultra runs fine on the 7600 XT, despite this including ray tracing, whereas the 7600 with only 8 gigabytes of VRAM gets absolutely crushed. So it's just not enough VRAM for these settings, despite the card being powerful enough that it would probably otherwise run okay. At medium settings, we're seeing less of a VRAM issue, and the 7600 XT jumps up to 73. But we can see the GPU usage on the B580 isn't maxed out, so that's being held back by that driver issue, which I'm hoping is solved later on for you guys. Here we're looking at resolution scaling. This game doesn't have FSR or XeSS, but it does have just a TAA upscaler, so you can upscale with that. And that does help performance out a bit at 1440p Ultra to get the 7600 XT up to 52, whereas the 7600 is just getting absolutely crushed. The B580 might be held back a bit by those driver issues. You can definitely see it dipping below 90% GPU usage at times. 1440p at medium settings, the 7600 is getting crushed. So medium settings were kind of passable at 1080p on 8 gigabytes, there, but it's not enough for 1440p medium. And the 7600 XT is hitting 51 FPS, so it's not like completely unreasonable settings, although it is below 60 FPS. If we use render scaling with the TAA upscaler at 66% per axis, the 7600 XT is now hitting 67 FPS. The 8 gigabyte card is doing a lot better now, so it seems like lowering the internal rendering resolution helped it stay within its 8 gigabyte buffer. It's definitely really close to the edge though, so it's possible you could see issues in other scenes in the game if they use a bit more VRAM than the opening scene. Let's move on to Unreal Engine 5 with Silent Hill 2. At 1080p epic settings with the hardware ray tracing turned on, the B580 shows a massive ray tracing advantage, and it's not just VRAM related, because the B580 is beating the 16 gigabyte 7600 XT by a wide margin at 35 versus 27. That being said, the overall frame rate is only 35, so these probably aren't the settings you'd use anyway. If we go to epic settings without RT, now the 7600 XT and the B580 are tied at 40 FPS, so you'd still probably turn down the settings further, but we're also seeing the 7600 catch up and hit 38 FPS as well. At 1080p medium settings, they're all basically tied at 52 or 54. So VRAM's not an issue, and these are more like the settings you would actually use, considering our frame rates are now closer to 60 FPS. This is a slow enough paced game that I think you'd be fine here as long as you had a variable refresh rate display. At 1080p low settings, we're now pushing 80 FPS on all of the cards. Very similar performance, and again, so if you're after the high refresh rate experience in this game, you do need to go to low settings, although the low settings in this game still look very good. And if you have enough VRAM to turn textures and things back up as well. Silent Hill 2, at 1440p epic settings, hardware RT turned on, but with resolution scaling, none of the GPUs are doing great, but the B580 has an advantage. You wouldn't use those settings though. At 1440p medium settings, with the upscaling turned on, we're hitting 48, 49 on the B580 and 7600 XT, and the 7600 hanging out at 45. So, you know, it's playable in this slow pace of a game. Personally, I'd probably chase a bit higher frame rates though. So if you go down to low settings and keep upscaling enabled, we're now above 60 FPS on all the GPUs, and they're all fairly close together at 63, 65, and 67 for the 7600, 7600 XT, and B580 respectively. At 1440p low settings with no upscaling, the B580 shows a larger advantage. So at native 1440p resolution, it does a bit better relatively than it did when upscaling was enabled, indicating the AMD cards are benefiting more from upscaling than the Intel card. In Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga at 1080p high settings, we see the 7600 XT furthest ahead here, and the 7600 is performing badly enough relatively to it that that's likely indicating that we're a little bit over 8 gigabytes of VRAM on AMD cards here. At the medium settings, the 7600 and XT version are much closer together at 60 and 63 respectively, whereas the B580 is hanging back at 51. So at medium settings, AMD is much better relative to Intel in this particular game as opposed to high settings. It's kind of interesting how different settings can perform differently. Switching back to high settings, but also 1440p resolution, we see the B580 back to almost tied with the 7600 XT. And we also see the 7600 8GB card falling further back, indicating VRAM issues, but none of the GPUs are performing particularly well here. I also noticed my 1% lows are wrong. I must have not, whatever. Like, you're not going to use these settings anyway. Don't look. It didn't happen. I promise. Guys, I'm so tired. I've ran so many benchmarks. Anyway, excuse any issues with that. So once again, my 1% lows are wrong, so I'm not going to, I'm going to cover that up. Don't look at the 1% lows. Look at them up there. But anyway, the average frame rates, it looks like I got correct on this one. Jeez, Daniel. Anyway, at 1440p high settings, you are hitting 49 or 51 FPS on the B580 and the 7600 XT, indicating they're fine. But the 7600 is having VRAM issues and only hitting 33 FPS. At 1440p medium settings, we're hitting, again, seeing that the medium settings seem to favor AMD relatively compared to the high settings, where the 7600 XT pulls up to 44 FPS. And I'm still covering up the 1% lows because apparently I just forgot 1% lows existed for a while when I was typing these out. So my head is just going to block those out, and I've got a big head, so we should be fine. All right, at 1440p medium with XeSS and FSR upscaling, we see that the GPUs are performing fairly similarly. They're all over 60 FPS, but the B580 is the furthest behind, once again showing that the medium settings are more favorable to AMD relative to Intel when compared with the high settings. If we go to Horizon Forbidden West, it looks like I once again realized that 1% lows exist and I should be typing them in, so I'll move my fat head. And the at 1080p very high settings, we're running into VRAM issues again on the 7600, and the cards are fast enough for it because we're hitting 65 and 70 on the cards that have enough VRAM, with the B580 in the lead. At 1080p medium settings, the performance is a lot closer together because now we're not going over the 8GB VRAM buffer. The B580 is still in the lead, but not by as much, at 92 versus 89. So let's go ahead and keep rolling to the 1440p very high settings. This is again crushing the 8GB card, but the cards with more than 8GB are fine. The B580 is way in the lead though at 55 versus 48, so this is reasonable to play on a variable refresh rate display on the B580, although you might still want a bit better performance. If you enable upscaling on the very high settings at 1440p, now the B580 is over 60 FPS at 64, but the 7600 XT is not too far behind at 59. And the 7600 is still just getting crushed. Its 1% lows are actually getting destroyed, and for some reason it's worse than at native. And I don't know why, but I did quit out of the game and restart it a couple of times to confirm, and that's just what was happening. Weird stuff happens when you run out of VRAM. Sometimes the results are kind of unpredictable or inconsistent. Anyway, 1440p medium settings, we can see all the GPUs are over 60, but the B580 jumps out to 72 compared to the 61 and 62 on the AMD cards, so much better results there. At medium settings, 1440p, but with upscaling, we're seeing that the B580 jumps out to 83, and the 7600 XT closes some of the gap, hitting 80. The 7600 hits 77. And Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, this game always uses ray tracing as a software fallback for GPUs without hardware RT, unlike Indiana Jones. But it does always use some form of ray tracing and hardware RT on cards that have it, like these. The B580 jumps out to a big lead here, indicating a ray tracing advantage for Intel's Arc GPU. At 1080p medium settings, we see the B580 again in the lead, but all of the GPUs are actually doing fairly well here, being at around 60 FPS on the AMD cards and 71 FPS on the B580. With the 1440p Ultra settings, all of the GPUs just get crushed. So there's not a lot to say other than the B580 was still technically winning in a everybody loses sort of situation. At 1440p Ultra with upscaling, the B580 now isn't doing as well. And I was a little confused by this result. Honestly, I don't know. And actually, if I wasn't running up against the review embargo deadline, I almost want to retest the B580 to see if it would win, because it was usually winning in this game. But anyway, 1440p medium settings, we see the B580 jump back into the lead at 51 versus 41. And that gives it a big lead here by 24%, and a big lead in the 1% lows as well. At 1440p medium with upscaling, we're now getting near that 60 FPS mark, and the GPUs are more close together. So I guess it's just the medium settings at 1440p, the B580 was kind of underperforming. So, hey, guess that's what we got. Let's move on to Cyberpunk with some ray tracing. If we go to 1080p Ultra settings but turn on RT reflections, and only RT reflections, nothing else, the B580 can actually manage to be around 60 FPS, 58 in the built-in benchmark run. The 7600 XT is at 44 and the 7600 at just 40. So this is once again showing that the B580 has a big ray tracing lead over these AMD GPUs. At 1080p Ultra without ray tracing, the B580 is still furthest ahead, but by a smaller margin, hitting 95 versus 85 on the 7600 XT and 77 on the 7600. At 1440p Ultra with RT reflections and upscaling, the B580 is able to hit 59 FPS, so totally playable. Whereas the 7600 XT and 7600 are at 40 and 46 which, not great. I probably wouldn't use that. The B580 is at least passable, you might. But what if we turned off the ray tracing and went to native resolution? Well, 1440p Ultra native resolution, the B580 is hitting 62 FPS. The 7600 XT is just hanging out at 52, 48 on the 7600. So Cyberpunk seems to be a good game for the B580. If we turn on upscaling, the B580 is still ahead, but the gap closes a bit. The B580 hits 75 FPS. We get 69 nice on the 7600 XT, and the 7600 is hitting 63. And Call of Duty Black Ops 6 is an AMD game. They tend to really perform well in Call of Duty titles, and that is what we're seeing here. Even the 7600 non-XT takes a 27% advantage over the B580 and a 32% advantage for the XT version. But all of them are getting high frame rates. It's 167, 173, and 131, so you can definitely play the game. Do keep in mind I'm testing a competitive game at the basic settings, so pretty low on the graphic settings tier list. But I think that's to simulate, how people actually play competitive games, which is they turn down graphic settings to get a higher frame rate, or at least that's how I do it. That's how a lot of people do it, and I know it's not everybody. Now, 1440p basic settings, the gap closes a bit, but it's still a pretty big lead for the AMD cards at 19% and 23% advantage, respectively. At 1440p basic with upscaling, we see the advantage at 14% and 18%. So in general, again, this is a good game for the AMD GPUs, and that tends to be the case versus NVIDIA as well. So what did we learn from all of this ridiculous amount of benchmarks, other than occasionally I just forgot to type in the 1% lows? Oh my goodness. Anyway, what we learned is, well, kind of what we saw in the summary, but we got to see it a lot. Take it in game by game. Think about also the frame rates we were hitting, because that's kind of a big deal. Because if you just look at relative performance charts like this one, there's a lot of results in here that aren't the settings you would actually use. And a lot of those are the ones where the B580 has a big advantage over the 7600 because a lot of times if you turn down graphic settings to get a higher frame rate, you also use less VRAM. That being said, with more VRAM, you can keep up certain settings like textures, which don't have a big performance impact, but do generally look a lot nicer. So there is definitely something to be said for that. But to wrap up the video, again, the B580 in just performance numbers and VRAM capacity crushes the 7600 at the same price. In ray tracing, it crushes it or ties it in pretty much any game you throw at it. Against the 7600 XT version, it's a lot closer of a match. I'd call it a draw in relative performance overall, although a win for the B580 in ray tracing still. Also, I'd say a win in the upscaling results. The only thing holding me back on this, like, just buy the B580. It beats everything in the price class. And watch my NVIDIA video, and it also beats at least the value proposition of the NVIDIA cards as well. But again, I do tend to run into more driver issues still on Intel than I do on AMD and NVIDIA. That's just the experience that I've had. It is getting better. If that doesn't scare you off too much, I think the B580 represents good value. If you're a little scared of not having a smooth experience when games first launch, they'll probably get patched. Like I said, they'll probably get patched and work fine eventually. But if you're playing games when they first launch, it just seems like you might be more likely to run into issues on Intel than AMD and NVIDIA at this point. And that is still the case, even if it's gotten better. It's gotten a lot better. It's way better than 2 years ago. And huge props to Intel's drivers team for making that progress. They're plugging away. And I love that Intel is positioning themselves so competitively. Again, up against its direct price competitor with the 7600, it beats it in performance, it has more VRAM, it crushes it in ray tracing, and it has a better upscaler. It's a lot of good stuff going for it. If I hadn't run into a single driver issue, I would just say run out and buy it. But that wasn't the case. Hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting. If you want access to these side-by-sides where you see the whole thing without me skipping ahead, hit the join button down below and get access to that on the channel members feed. And if you're interested again in the details and how this stacked up against like the RTX 3060 and RTX 4060, I did a video just like this one with all of the same games and all of that and big charts and everything. So find that video on my channel and consider subscribing even if you like my content. That would be a thing. Anyway, I hope you guys have an excellent day.